She inherited her great-aunt's crumbling farmhouse that hadn't been lived in for decades. Everyone laughed, calling it a money pit that would bankrupt her. But when her rescue dog started obsessively scratching at the basement wall, Isabella realized this forgotten house was hiding a secret worth $2 million that would change her life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what's the oldest building you've ever explored. The perpetual hum of Boston traffic had become Isabella Whitmore's lullaby. At 31, she navigated the narrow streets of Back Bay with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find peace in chaos. Her third-floor walk-up on Marlborough Street was barely 400 square feet, but the rent consumed half her income as a freelance web designer. Every morning, she squeezed past neighbors in the hallway, clutching her laptop bag and a coffee that cost more than some people spent on lunch. Isabella had architected her life with surgical precision. Client calls at 9 a.m., design work until 3 p.m., a quick walk to the common, dinner from whatever takeout place had the shortest line. She measured success in completed projects and on-time rent payments, not in square footage or family connections. The city had taught her that survival meant staying lean, staying focused, and staying unattached to anything that couldn't fit in a suitcase. Her apartment was a study in minimalism born of necessity. A fold-out desk that doubled as a dining table. A Murphy bed that revealed her living room when tucked away. One bookshelf, carefully curated. The only indulgence was the oversized dog bed in the corner, home to her constant companion and the single impulsive decision that had changed her life 3 years earlier. Charlie was supposed to be a small dog. The shelter in Quincy had promised she'd max out at 30 pounds. Instead, the golden retriever mix had grown into an 80-pound gentle giant whose tail could clear a coffee table in one enthusiastic wag. He was Isabella's opposite in every conceivable way. Where she craved routine, Charlie embraced spontaneity. Where she preferred the predictable rhythm of city life, Charlie yearned for space to run and dirt to dig. But they had found their rhythm in the cramped apartment, two creatures who understood what it meant to make the best of limited circumstances. Isabella's family existed primarily as names in her phone's contact list. Her parents had died in a car accident during her sophomore year at Emerson College, leaving her with student loans and a fierce independence that she wore like armor. The extended family scattered across New England sent Christmas cards with photos of children she'd never met and invitations to gatherings she politely declined. Distance was easier. Distance meant never having to explain why she'd chosen a studio apartment over suburban expectations, why she'd picked freedom over the family business that her cousins had inherited. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Isabella was 3 cups of coffee deep into a website redesign for a boutique hotel when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The area code was 413, Western Massachusetts, somewhere she associated with fall foliage and tourist traffic. She almost let it go to voicemail. "Miss Whitmore? This is Eleanor Hartwell from Hartwell and Associates in Willowbrook. I'm calling regarding your great-aunt Cordelia's estate." Isabella set down her coffee carefully, searching her memory. Cordelia Whitmore. The name surfaced slowly, attached to fragments of childhood visits that felt more like dreams than memories. A tall woman with silver hair who always smelled like lavender and fresh bread. A farmhouse with a wraparound porch where Isabella had spent one magical summer when she was 7, before her parents decided she was old enough to stay home alone during their business trips. "I'm sorry," Isabella said, suddenly aware that she was holding her breath. "Did you say estate?" "Your great-aunt passed away 6 weeks ago," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered such news regularly. "She left specific instructions that you were to inherit her property. The Willowbrook estate has been in your family for over a century." The words felt surreal. Isabella found herself staring at her laptop screen, where a half-finished webpage about luxury accommodations suddenly seemed absurd. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think there might be some mistake. I barely knew my great-aunt. We haven't spoken in, it must be over 20 years." "She remembered you quite well," the lawyer replied. "She specifically mentioned that you were the only child who ever asked her about the garden behind the house. She left detailed instructions that the property should go to you, along with all contents and the 47 acres surrounding the main house." Isabella grabbed a pen and started writing on the back of a client invoice. "Property. Acres. Contents. The words felt foreign, like vocabulary from a language she'd never learned. What exactly are we talking about here? The Willowbrook estate includes a two-story farmhouse built in 1887, several outbuildings, and working farmland. The property has been maintained through a trust, though the house itself has been vacant since your great-aunt moved to assisted living 4 years ago. After the call ended, Isabella sat in her apartment's single chair, staring at the notes she'd scribbled. Charlie seemed to sense her distraction, padding over to rest his enormous head on her knee. She scratched behind his ears absently, trying to process the concept of ownership on a scale she'd never imagined. The photographs arrived by email an hour later. Isabella opened them on her laptop, enlarging each image to study the details. The farmhouse was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. White clapboard siding that had weathered to a soft gray. Black shutters that hung at angles suggesting years of New England winters. A wraparound porch that sagged in the middle but still maintained the elegant proportions of Victorian-era craftsmanship. The grounds told a story of gradual surrender to nature. What had once been manicured lawns were now meadows of tall grass punctuated by apple trees that had grown wild and spreading. A red barn leaned at an angle that defied physics, held upright by stubbornness and the thick vines that had claimed its walls. Smaller outbuildings dotted the landscape like pieces of a puzzle that time had scattered, but it was the size that overwhelmed her. Isabella tried to imagine herself in those rooms, rattling around in a house that could hold 6 of her current apartments. The very concept of 47 acres was beyond her urban comprehension. Central Park was 843 acres, and that felt infinite. This property would be her responsibility, her burden, her inheritance whether she wanted it or not. News of Isabella's inheritance spread through her circle with the speed of social media and the efficiency of disbelief. The reactions were swift, unanimous, and predictably discouraging. Her cousin Marcus called from his law office in Hartford within hours of her posting a single cryptic photo on Instagram. "Bella, please tell me you're not actually considering keeping that place. Do you have any idea what rural property maintenance costs? We're talking about heating bills that could fund a small country." Her college roommate Jenna was more direct during their weekly FaceTime call. "Honey, you can barely afford your current rent. How are you going to manage property taxes on a place that size? And 47 acres? What are you going to do? Become a farmer? You killed a cactus last month." Even her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who rarely ventured beyond pleasantries about the weather, felt compelled to offer advice when she encountered Isabella in the mailbox vestibule. "My sister inherited a farmhouse upstate back in the 90s, she said, shaking her head with the authority of secondhand experience. "Spent $30,000 just to make it habitable, then couldn't find a buyer when she tried to sell. These old places are money pits, dear. Beautiful money pits." The most painful conversation came from her Uncle Robert, her father's brother who had always maintained the role of family patriarch despite Isabella's polite resistance to his guidance. His call came on a Thursday evening when she was trying to focus on a particularly challenging coding problem. "Cordelia was always eccentric," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the dismissive tone he reserved for family members who failed to meet his standards of practical decision-making. Living out there alone for all those years, talking to her plants like they were people. The house is probably falling down by now. Mice, mold, foundation problems. Rural properties are nothing but headaches." "I haven't even seen it yet," Isabella protested, surprised by the defensive edge in her own voice. "That's my point exactly. You're making emotional decisions about something you know nothing about. If I were you, I'd contact a real estate agent immediately. Sell the land to a developer. Take whatever you can get and invest it sensibly. This fantasy about country living isn't realistic for someone in your situation." Her situation. The phrase echoed in Isabella's mind long after the call ended. Her situation was a 400-square-foot apartment and client work that barely covered her expenses. Her situation was having no backup plan, no family safety net, no inherited wealth to cushion the inevitable failures of freelance life. But somehow, Uncle Robert's casual dismissal of her capabilities stung more than any practical concern about property maintenance. That night, she lay in her Murphy bed with Charlie sprawled across 3/4 of the available space, listening to the sounds of the city that never quite stopped. Sirens, late-night conversations from the street below, the hum of her neighbor's television through the thin walls. She thought about her great-aunt Cordelia, a woman who had chosen silence and space over the constant noise of urban existence. Isabella had built her adult life around logical decisions. She researched every purchase, compared prices across multiple vendors, maintained spreadsheets for expenses that most people tracked in their heads. But there was something about this inheritance that resisted logical analysis. Maybe it was the fragment of memory she'd recovered during Mrs. Hartwell's call, the sense of vast rooms and afternoon light, of a woman who had listened when 7-year-old Isabella chattered about the flowers growing wild behind the house. Saturday morning found Isabella loading Charlie into her 10-year-old Subaru Forester, the back seat packed with supplies that suggested either a day trip or an expedition to unexplored territory. Bottled water, energy bars, a first aid kit, flashlights, work gloves, and a bag of Charlie's favorite treats. She told herself this was reconnaissance, a fact-finding mission to assess the property before making any permanent decisions. The drive west from Boston took her through landscapes that seemed to exist in a different century. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to suburban shopping centers, then to rural highways bordered by stone walls and dairy farms. Charlie pressed his nose to the window with growing excitement, his tail beating a steady rhythm against the door as the scents filtering through the vents changed from exhaust and asphalt to pine and fresh earth. Isabella had forgotten how much sky existed outside the city. The canopy of buildings that defined her daily world was replaced by an endless blue dome broken only by clouds that cast moving shadows across rolling hills. The GPS on her phone showed her route as a thin blue line threading through vast expanses of green, each mile taking her further from cell towers and closer to something she couldn't quite name. Willowbrook announced itself with a wooden sign weathered to illegibility and a general store that looked like it had been frozen in 1952. Population 847, according to a smaller sign that someone had riddled with what appeared to be buckshot. Isabella stopped for gas and directions, finding herself the object of polite curiosity from the elderly man behind the counter who seemed genuinely pleased to learn she was Cordelia's great-niece. "Wonderful woman," he said, counting out her change with deliberate care. "Always brought me vegetables from her garden. Tomatoes the size of softballs. House is about 3 miles up Maple Ridge Road. You can't miss it. Been sitting empty too long, if you ask me. Houses need people, same as people need houses." The final approach to the Willowbrook estate followed a dirt road that wound through mature maples and oak trees whose branches formed a living tunnel overhead. Isabella drove slowly, partly from caution and partly from the growing sense that she was approaching something significant. Charlie had abandoned his window perch to pace back and forth across the back seat, whining with an excitement she'd never seen before. The farmhouse revealed itself gradually as the road curved past a stand of white birch trees. Isabella parked near what had once been a circular driveway and sat for a moment, engine running, trying to reconcile the reality before her with the photographs she'd studied obsessively for the past week. The house was larger than she'd imagined, more imposing and more graceful at the same time. The Victorian proportions that had seemed quaint in pictures now felt monumental, a statement of permanence and ambition that belonged to an era when families built homes to last for generations. The wraparound porch, despite its obvious need for attention, maintained an elegance that spoke of summer evenings and conversations that lasted past sunset. But it was the signs of abandonment that caught her attention most forcefully. Shutters hung at angles that suggested years of winter storms. The front steps had settled into a precarious lean that would challenge anyone brave enough to attempt them. Windows were clouded with grime and draped with spider webs that caught the afternoon light like intricate lacework. Isabella turned off the engine and stepped out, immediately struck by the quality of the silence. No traffic, no sirens, no urban hum. Just the whisper of wind through tall grass and the distant call of birds she couldn't identify. The air smelled of earth and growing things, underlaid with the faint sweetness of fruit, trees gone wild. Charlie burst from the car with explosive joy, racing in wide circles around the yard before settling into serious investigation of scents that told stories Isabella could only imagine. He moved with purpose, nose to the ground, tail creating a blur of excitement as he mapped the territory according to some ancient canine logic. The key Mrs. Hartwell had provided turned easily in the front door, as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. Isabella stepped into the foyer and immediately felt the weight of accumulated time. Dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows filmed with neglect. The air carried the scent of old wood and faded flowers, as if the house remembered its purpose even in abandonment. She moved through rooms that felt both foreign and familiar, each space larger than her entire Boston apartment. The kitchen dominated the back of the house, its centerpiece a massive cast-iron stove that suggested meals prepared for large families and hired hands. Mason jars lined open shelves, their contents long since crystallized into abstract art. A wooden table scarred by decades of use occupied the center of the room, surrounded by chairs that had been pushed back as if the last meal had just ended. The living room centered around a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, its mantel decorated with photographs that chronicled decades of family gatherings. Isabella studied the faces of people who shared her bone structure and stubborn chin, trying to place herself in a lineage she'd never bothered to explore. One photograph showed a young woman in overalls standing beside a vegetable garden, her smile suggesting secrets and satisfaction in equal measure. As she explored, Charlie ranged through the house with the confidence of a dog discovering his ancestral home. He paused at doorways, investigated corners, and gradually made his way toward a door she hadn't yet opened. When she found him, he was sitting at the top of a set of wooden stairs that led down into darkness, his body tense with attention. The basement stairs creaked under Isabella's weight, each step releasing the scent of earth and stone that spoke of foundations dug deep and built to last. Charlie bounded ahead, his claws clicking on the wooden steps with eager purpose. The basement was cooler than the rest of the house, with fieldstone walls that wept moisture and a dirt floor packed hard by more than a century of use. Isabella swept her phone's flashlight across the space, revealing the accumulated detritus of rural life. Garden tools hung from hooks driven into the mortar between stones. Wooden shelves lined one wall, holding mason jars filled with preserves that had long since turned to abstract art. A workbench occupied one corner, its surface scarred by projects and repairs that had kept the farm running through decades of changing seasons. But Charlie had no interest in the obvious contents of the basement. He went directly to the far wall, where he began scratching at the stones with unusual persistence. Isabella called him away, but he returned immediately to the same spot, whining softly and pawing at the wall with increasing intensity. "What is it, boy?" she asked, but Charlie was beyond distraction. He scratched at the wall with the focused determination he usually reserved for squirrels that had dared to venture too close to his territory. Isabella knelt beside him, running her hands over the stones where he'd been scratching. The wall felt different here. The stones seemed newer somehow, though they were covered with the same moss and grime as the rest of the basement. As her fingers traced the mortar lines, she felt something that made her pause. One of the stones gave slightly under pressure, shifting inward with a soft grinding sound that suggested it wasn't quite settled in place like the others. The mortar around its edges crumbled at her touch, as if it had been mixed with something less permanent than the rest of the wall. Isabella pressed harder, and the stone moved inward with surprising ease. Behind it, her phone's flashlight revealed empty space, a deliberate hollow that definitely wasn't part of the original foundation. Pepper's scratching had uncovered what looked like a hiding place, built into the very bones of the house. As Isabella worked the loose stone free, it slid inward to reveal a cavity large enough to hold something. The darkness beyond swallowed her phone's light, but she could see the edges of objects that had been carefully placed inside the hidden space. The gleam of metal, the corner of what looked like wooden boxes, and the unmistakable signs that someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal whatever lay within. Charlie whined and pawed at the opening, his excitement suggesting that whatever sense emanated from the hiding place told stories that only he could interpret. Isabella reached into the cavity, her fingers encountering smooth wood and cold metal before she pulled back, suddenly aware that she was alone in a basement miles from anywhere, about to discover secrets that had been hidden for decades. Her great-aunt Cordelia, the eccentric woman who talked to plants and lived alone for years, had been keeping something valuable enough to hide, important enough to conceal behind false stones in a foundation that had weathered more than a century of New England seasons. The cavity was deeper than she'd expected, extending back into the foundation itself. Whatever was hidden there had been placed with care, wrapped and protected against time and moisture. Isabella's heart hammered as she realized that this crumbling farmhouse, this inheritance that everyone had dismissed as worthless, held secrets that could change everything. Isabella's hands trembled as she reached deeper into the cavity behind the false stone. Her phone's flashlight revealed the edges of carefully wrapped packages, each one protected by multiple layers of oiled cloth that had kept moisture at bay for decades. Charlie whined beside her, his excitement palpable as she carefully extracted the first bundle. The package was heavier than expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, but with the weight of something far more substantial. As she unwrapped the protective cloth, Isabella's breath caught. Inside was a wooden cigar box, its cedar surface polished to a warm glow despite its age. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. The box contained what appeared to be coins, but unlike any currency she'd ever seen. These were larger, heavier, with the unmistakable gleam of gold catching her flashlight beam. Each coin was individually wrapped in tissue paper, arranged in careful rows that spoke of obsessive organization. A small card tucked into the lid read, in her gray-tant's careful handwriting, "Collection began 1952. For the future of the farm." Isabella reached back into the cavity and found a second package, then a third. Each contained similar wooden boxes, all filled with gold coins of varying sizes and origins. American eagles, Canadian maples, South African krugerrants, dates spanning from the 1950s through the early 2000s. Every coin was in pristine condition, protected by her gray-tant's meticulous care. With trembling hands, Isabella used her phone to research current gold prices, calculating the approximate value of what she'd found. The coins alone were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The gold bars pushed the total well beyond the $1 million mark. When she factored in the numismatic value of some of the older coins, the collection approached $2 million in current market value. Charlie had settled beside her, sensing her emotional state with the intuition that made him such a perfect companion. As Isabella processed the implications of her discovery, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of both her great-aunt and her own future. Cordelia Whitmore hadn't been the eccentric recluse that family stories had portrayed. She had been a brilliant investor who understood that true wealth wasn't about displaying prosperity, but about preserving it. While others had chased fashionable investments and get-rich-quick schemes, she had followed the oldest investment strategy in human history: buy gold when others are fearful and hold it for the long term. The implications for Isabella's life were staggering. The financial security she'd never dared to hope for was literally in her hands. She could pay off her student loans, buy a real apartment, build the kind of cushion that would allow her to take creative risks in her work instead of scrambling for any project that paid the bills. But it was more than just the money. The discovery revealed that she came from people who thought in generations, who planned for futures they might not live to see. Cordelia had worked her small farm for decades, living frugally and investing wisely, all to leave a legacy for a great niece she barely knew but somehow trusted. As Isabella carefully rewrapped the gold and returned it to its hiding place, she made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would not sell the Willowbrook estate. Instead, she would honor her great-aunt's legacy by moving to the farmhouse and using the discovery to restore the property to its former glory. The gold would give her the freedom to take her time, to learn about rural life, to perhaps even restart the gardens that Cordelia had tended with such care. She could renovate the house properly, preserving its character while making it livable for the 21st century. The outbuildings could be restored, the land put back into productive use. For the first time in years, Isabella felt the possibility of a life that wasn't measured by monthly rent payments and client deadlines. She could build something lasting, something that honored both her great-aunt's memory and her own dreams of creative independence. 3 months later, Isabella stood on the newly repaired front porch of the Willowbrook estate, watching Charlie race across the meadow in pursuit of something only he could see. The house behind her hummed with the activity of restoration. Contractors working on the roof, electricians updating the wiring, plumbers installing modern conveniences while preserving the home's historic character. She had sold her Boston apartment and moved permanently to Willowbrook, using a small portion of the gold to fund the renovations while keeping the majority safely stored in a proper vault. The local bank president, when she'd appeared with documentation of her inheritance, had treated her with the kind of respect usually reserved for established wealth. The garden behind the house was already showing signs of new life. Isabella had hired a local landscaper to help restore Cordelia's vegetable plots, and she spent her evenings learning about soil composition and companion planting. Her web design business had actually grown since the move. Clients seemed charmed by her rural address, and the reliable internet she'd installed allowed her to work with companies around the world. But the most surprising change was in herself. The constant anxiety that had defined her urban existence had gradually faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and permanence she'd never experienced. She was no longer just surviving from month to month, but building something that could last for generations. The townspeople of Willowbrook had welcomed her with the kind of community spirit that city life had never offered. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had brought her fresh eggs and advice about local contractors. The pastor from the Methodist church had stopped by to share stories about Cordelia's quiet generosity to local families in need. As Isabella watched the sunset paint the hills around her property in shades of gold that reminded her of her great aunt's hidden treasure, she understood that the real inheritance hadn't been the money at all. It had been the lesson that true wealth comes from patience, planning, and the courage to live according to your own values rather than others' expectations. The farmhouse that everyone had dismissed as a worthless burden had become her sanctuary. The eccentric great-aunt who talked to plants had left her a roadmap for a life of purpose and independence. And the dog who had led her to the hidden cavity had found his true home in the wide spaces and endless adventures that rural life provided. Isabella pulled out her phone and took a photo of Charlie silhouetted against the evening sky, then posted it to social media with a simple caption. Sometimes the best inheritances are the ones nobody else wants. The responses came quickly. Friends from Boston expressing amazement at her transformation. Family members who had dismissed the farmhouse now asking when they could visit. Uncle Robert, who had insisted she sell immediately, left a comment that made her smile. Perhaps I was too hasty in my assessment. But the comment that meant the most came from Eleanor Hartwell, the lawyer who had first told her about the inheritance. Cordelia would be so proud. She always said the house was waiting for someone who would understand its true value. As darkness settled over the Willowbrook estate, Isabella sat in the restored rocking chair on her front porch, listening to the symphony of night sounds that had replaced the urban noise of her former life. Charlie sprawled at her feet, content in a way he'd never been in the city apartment. The crumbling farmhouse that everyone had laughed at had revealed its secrets to someone patient enough to look beyond the surface. And in doing so, it had given Isabella something more valuable than gold: the freedom to build a life of her own choosing, grounded in the wisdom of those who came before and oriented toward a future she was now free to design. The $2 million secret had changed everything, just as the opening hook had promised. But the real transformation had been in learning that sometimes the things others dismiss as worthless hold the greatest treasures of all. If this story inspired you to look beyond the surface of your own opportunities, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need a reminder that hidden treasures are everywhere. You just have to be patient enough to find them.